Today, I'm a bride on my big day. I build with something old, try out something new, borrow some tools, and at one point find myself feeling very blue.
Oh no.
I've been holding on to a really unique piece of wood for about a year. Normally, I just do commission work, which means I have no idea when the right job is going to come along to put this material to use. But I was itching to build something fun and creative, so I decided to just make something with it and put it up for sale. Here's what I came up with. We're going to build a 48-inch round tabletop using this. So this is old growth redwood. Now, before you get all, hey, that's not cool, those are protected and you can't cut them down anymore, trust me, I know. But hear me out. This is actually the root, or at least part of one of the roots, of a redwood tree. You see, back in the day when people were cutting these things down all willy-nilly, they left a trail of stumps in their wake. And now, since thankfully laws have been enacted to prevent that sort of thing from happening, people are coming up with all sorts of creative ways to get their hands on this precious material. One of the things that's being done is folks are going back and digging up the stumps and root structures that were left behind that are otherwise just going to be left to rot in the ground. I'll share a bit more about the story behind this particular tree later in the video, but for now, let's take a look at the design of what we're going to build using this beautiful piece of wood. Obviously, it's going to take some work to turn this long, narrow slab into a large diameter circle. Given the unique nature of this wood and the tight, wavy growth rings within it, I really wanted to keep as much of the live edges intact as possible. Since one section had this curve which approximated the arc of the circle, I decided to start there with the layout. After cutting that section off, I was able to put the remaining section of the slab on the opposite side, producing only a very small amount of waste. In between the two main pieces would be some jet black epoxy, along with a few offcuts from the same tree stump. After cutting off that bit of waste at the bandsaw, it was time to clean up all of the live edges. This was my first experience working with redwood, and man is it soft. I'm not sure how the wood from the trunk itself compares, perhaps it's a bit denser than the roots, but this stuff was super lightweight and incredibly dry. So I really had to be careful not to take too much off with the carving disc and wire brush. This was also my first time building a round mold for an epoxy pour. I used some scrap melamine for the base, joining each section with caulk and Tyvek tape. For the sides of the mold, I went with landscape border, a technique I borrowed from Cam at Blacktail Studio. But this strategy requires you to build the mold in place around the wood, which almost led to me forgetting to spray the mold release at this point. Luckily, I remembered before I got too far along. Also, don't forget to move or cover up the wood before spraying. There's a lot of overspray, and the last thing you want to do is inhibit the wood from bonding with the epoxy. I screwed the border directly into the wood and used caulk around the bottom outside edge. Now, typically I prefer to seal every joint from both the outside and the inside, but because I screwed directly into the wood, I didn't have access to the inside edges. Because I didn't have my double layer of caulk, I decided to do an initial pour with thicker tabletop epoxy. This helps in a few ways. First, because it's more viscous, it's actually harder for it to work its way through a small pinhole gap. Also, because it cures much more quickly than a deep pour epoxy, if there was a leak, it would stop after just a couple of hours as it hardens up. And as it turns out, I didn't have a single leak. So once that first pour had set up and was still a bit tacky, I went ahead with the deep pour. By the way, I added black trans tint dye to each of these pours. While the epoxy in the top was curing, I got to work on the table base. Now, when I started this project, I really didn't have a plan for the base. The only thing I knew for sure was that I wanted a pedestal-style base, rather than, say, 4 independent legs. It's just a pet peeve of mine to sit at a table and constantly be banging my knee or the chair against the table legs. It's one thing if it's a large rectangular dining table, but with a smaller round table, there's just not as much room underneath. So that was my only constraint. I started playing around with something like this in my modeling software. It was nice, but the sharp edges and straight lines seemed to clash with the top, which has a lot of curves. So I tried to soften the angles a bit and liked this better, but it still didn't feel quite right. So I started looking at photos of old-growth redwoods for some inspiration, when I noticed a pretty cool feature that a lot of them shared. The tree trunks were often twisted along the long axis. I thought it seemed very mystical looking, and so I tried to apply that to my prior ideas for the base. First, I took the legs, straightened them out, and then twisted them about 45 degrees. But the proportions seemed all wrong. So I went back to the drawing board and eventually worked up this model, with thinner pieces that, when rotated in unison, created this almost hourglass-looking shape. And I immediately knew this was what I wanted to build. But how? That's a lot of angles, which means a lot of math and precision would be required. Also, I needed to make sure it was strong enough to support the top. Luckily, I was able to pull a lot of the measurements and calculate the angles from the model itself, which reduced the amount of math involved. Here, I've milled up some ash sticks that will make up the twisting part of the base, and I'm now cutting the top and bottom of each at a 28-degree angle. Each of these sticks will attach to a circular base plate, also made from ash. I glued up some small pieces here so as to limit the amount of waste involved in cutting a circle from a bunch of rectangular boards. Then I used the shaper to route a perfect circle which, after removing the excess material, could then be flushed up with a template bit. Those twisting sticks would also need to be stabilized at the middle, or the narrowest part of the hourglass shape. To do this, I cut a 3/4 inch dado on the inside face of each stick. These dados would be fitted and glued to a 3/4 inch piece of plywood at the center of the hourglass, which would hopefully be enough to hold everything together. But somehow when I was cutting all of those dados, one of them ended up being about a 1/16 of an inch off. So I just used a flush cut saw and a chisel to remove a sliver of material from the top of that groove. And then I simply glued it back in place on the opposite side. I wanted to soften all the edges on the base, so I used a block plane to add a bevel to each of the sticks. It probably would have been a little faster to do this at the router table, but after taking the time to dial in the bit and the fence settings, not all that much. Plus, it's nice to give my ears a break from the power tools. The entire base was dyed black using Rubio Monocoat Pre-Color Easy. Once the pre-color was applied, I pre-finished the inside of each stick since access would be limited after gluing up. For this I used Natura 1 Coat with some black trans tint dye added. I used this finish in my last 2 videos, but it turns out I was actually using an older version of the product. This time I had the new stuff, which you can identify by the colors on the label and the sweet new funnel on part A. If you've used Rubio or the old Natura formulation, you know how messy it gets trying to pour straight from the can. So props to those guys for using some common sense in their design. Once I had 4 sticks in place, I could stand it upright and continue working on the remaining pieces. At this point, I'm using screws to initially attach the base plate to each stick. This will prevent things from moving around when I drill the holes for the dowels, which will provide the strength for these connections. The top of the sticks will attach to a square piece of 3/4 inch ply, using the same screw and dowel method we used on the bottom. The plywood will then be recessed into the underside of the tabletop so that you'll never see it, and attached with threaded inserts and furniture bolts. At this point, the entire base is assembled, so I touched up any bare sections with Precolor Easy before applying the Natura top coat to the rest of the base. After about a week of curing, it was time to demold the tabletop. At 49 inches, this was a bit too wide to flatten using my router sled, so I took it over to the guys at Urban Industrial Design to have it surfaced on their CNC. Having an industrial wood shop nearby is awesome. This is actually where I bought my used 20-inch planer when they were upgrading. Anyway, these guys are great. They sell slabs and dimensional lumber, rent time on their machines, and do custom furniture. So if you happen to be in the Albany, New York area, definitely check them out. And no, this isn't sponsored or anything. I paid the $150 for the hour on their CNC and was happy to support their operation. So what I'm about to do was kind of a shot in the dark, but not entirely ludicrous. Either way, it didn't end up working, and I'm not exactly sure why. Here's what happened. Since redwood is notoriously soft, and this is supposed to be a dining table, I wanted to see if I could harden it up with some penetrating epoxy. I saw this done on a piece of Mappa Burl on the Blacktail channel, and it seemed to work for him, so I figured I'd give it a go and see what happened. For this, I used deep pour epoxy that I had thinned out with some acetone to help with penetration. I basted the whole top, continuing to apply more as it soaked it up. Let it cure for about a week and started sanding away the excess. But what I found was that by the time I had sanded down through that top layer of epoxy and exposed the wood, there didn't seem to be any resin embedded in the top layer of wood fibers. Not gonna lie, I was pretty disappointed. I wasted a whole week on this and was basically right back where I started after getting it home from the CNC. At least that's what I thought at the time. It turns out I created a much bigger problem for myself that will rear its head in just a little bit. If anyone has experience or thoughts on this process and why it didn't seem to work, let me know in the comments, because I'm stumped. Anyway, at this point I needed to get it cut into a perfect 48-inch diameter circle. So I made a circle cutting jig with some MDF, which I then anchored to the center of the table with a drill bit. After cutting off the excess with a jigsaw, I used this beast of a pattern bit to flush up the rest of the edge. Once the edge was cleaned up, I added a 45-degree chamfer to the underside of the table, taking a few passes here in order to limit the amount of material being removed during each pass. Now is probably a good time to give a little backstory on how this old-growth California redwood root ended up in my shop. I'll play this footage of me cutting the recess for the top of the base. Just know that it sucked. It took forever, broke one of my nice bits, and looked like crap when I was done. But it's going to get covered up by the base anyway, so I'm not going to stress over getting it to look perfect. Anyway, my wife and I were traveling to New Hampshire for a wedding last year. The wedding was great, and it was a nice little weekend getaway. When we were dating, we used to take little trips like this throughout New England all the time. So to stretch this nostalgic trip out a bit longer, we took our time coming back, stopped at some local shops, got coffee and lunch, that sort of thing. We also passed a place that had some slabs sitting out front. McNabb's Slabs, it was called. We walked in, and it's this one-room shop that's just overflowing with some of the most beautiful wood I've ever seen in person. And it was all West Coast species. Tons of redwood and claro walnut, Bastogne walnut, just beautiful stuff you don't typically come across in the Northeast. My wife said I was like a kid in a candy store, drooling over everything. Anyway, the owner comes out and introduces himself, and it turns up he grew up in Northern California and just recently moved here. Luckily for me, he brought along with him 2 tractor trailers full of logs, stumps, and roots that he'd salvaged from his property out west. Apparently, he mills them up in the building next door. So I'm looking at this root, and he's telling me all about the particular stump that it came from and how it was such a pain in the ass to get it out of the ground. He estimated it was around 800 years old and was just discarded, along with entire logs that were considered flawed 150 years ago when people were just trying to get dimensional lumber out of these trees. It was quite the story and honestly quite the education for me. I couldn't believe I was lucky enough to have just wandered in there on a whim. Anyway, somehow I managed to get out of there with only 4 boards in the back of my truck. Mostly because I knew it was only a couple hours drive from my home, so I can pretty easily get back there again. Anyway, if you're in the New England area and want to check it out, I'll leave their contact info in the description. The last step in this build was to get some finish on. I was initially planning to use General Finish's Armor Seal. But remember a little while ago when I said I'd created a big problem for myself with my attempt at that DIY penetrating epoxy? Well, that problem is about to slap me in the face. You see, when I was sanding away that top layer of penetrating epoxy, I could tell there was a very fine line between removing just the excess epoxy and starting to eat into that really soft wood. Well, apparently I didn't walk that line very well. So I just went to sand between coats of poly, and it seemed like the sander wasn't really hitting the whole surface, almost like it was riding on some high spots. So I took the level out and shined a light behind it, and there's just gaps everywhere. I just called my guy at the industrial shop and told him I botched it up real good, and he laughed and said he's been there before, but he told me I could come up in the morning and run it through the wide belt sander a few times, so I think that's it for tonight. I went up to their shop first thing the next morning, and the owner, Brian, dialed up the correct settings on their dual wide belt sander. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time Brian's bailed me out of a mess. A few years ago, I had bought a lot of material for a massive conference table. Well, thanks to my crappy moisture meter and only checking the moisture in some of the slabs, I nearly ended up with a bunch of unusable material. But he was able to add them into their next kiln run, and I narrowly averted disaster. That actually ended up being one of the coolest tables I've ever done, and who knows what would have happened if he hadn't have bailed me out. After getting back to the shop, I had to fill in the newly formed microbubbles that had popped up after resurfacing. The wide belt left it at 150, so I hit it with 180, water popped to raise the grain, and finished it up with 240. Then, after wiping and blowing off the dust, I used some mineral spirits to remove any residual particles. At this point, I was already running 2 weeks behind schedule, so I decided to stick with my trusted Natura hard wax oil for the finish. I also wasn't totally sure if the Armor Seal was the best option for this top, as I've read that poly can do some weird things if the wood underneath it gets dented, which is a real possibility with this species of wood. So I did 2 coats of Natura, abrading with a maroon pad in between. I usually just do 1 coat, but the redwood really drank this stuff up. Finally, after a year-long engagement, tons of planning and preparation, and second-guessing my decisions, the big day had arrived, and it was time for the ceremony. In the end, I think it was worth the effort and worth the wait. After all, this root had been waiting for more than a century, hidden in the ground with no real purpose after being carelessly separated from its trunk. Now it will be seen, likely provoking curious conversation among those who gather around it, and hopefully serving as a reminder that the natural world around us is to be treated with care and respect. Do you think it can happen? I do.